Continuing in our answer series, we come to a really interesting question today because it is the opposite question, kind of opposite, of a question that we've already answered. And the question is this: when Esther went into the king's court, could she have been killed? Now, the full question that title came from is this: in the Old Testament, when Esther went into the court of the king without being summoned, could the result have been that she would have been killed? Now, the short answer to this is absolutely yes. And there's a reason for it. I mean, she was probably going to be killed. And you say, okay, well, how does this relate to another lesson? Well, the other lesson was this: if the woman of Tekoa could not have been killed, why would Esther have been killed? Now, if the woman of Tekoa went in to see David, but this woman is Esther, and she's going to go in to see her husband. The longer answer is this: there is a world of difference between Israel and Persia, folks. Which, by the way, Persia, we call it today Iran. And from Israel to Persia, if you're flying from country to country, it is 1,069 miles by air. But of course, Esther couldn't have got there by air. She had to get there by foot. And to get there by foot, you had to go up to the northern part of Israel, go northeast, hit the Euphrates River, which is on the Fertile Crescent, head all the way down to the Persian Gulf, then take a trade route that goes up, swings around, and goes into Persia, 1,300 miles by foot. The story of Esther is in the Old Testament. And we'd say, okay, it's in the Old Testament. And one of the mistakes that we make as Christians and Bible readers is we tend to think that when we read the law of the Lord in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that it applies to the entire world. Well, it doesn't apply to the entire world. It only applies to the Jewish world there in the nation of Israel to begin with, until they're scattered, and finally later they come back and start obeying the laws later on, or trying to, when they come back from exile. But these Old Testament laws only apply to the nation of Israel. You see on my little map here, this little circle right in the middle of the map, that is Israel. But Persia is way over here in this bigger circle, because the country of Persia is much bigger than Israel. Now let me show you on a bigger map. At the time the story of Esther happens, this is the big circle, kind of a circle, is the Persian Empire, and there's Iran or Persia in that section. And by the way, this doesn't even include the area called the area of the country of the Medes. Remember, it's the Medes and the Persians were the rulers during this time. They're living over there, but they're ruling 127 provinces across this whole Persian Empire. So this Persian Empire was large, and at the time, Israel was part of this Persian Empire. And at that time, Jews, by the way, were scattered through all of the 127 provinces of the Persian Empire, all the way over to what we call Turkey, and in Egypt, and everywhere, all the way over to the border with India. There are Jews everywhere in this Persian Empire. That's a very important point. So as an introduction and a background, I don't want you to get lost on this. Nebuchadnezzar has the Babylonian Empire. When Nebuchadnezzar dies, his daughter has married a man who becomes the next ruler of the Babylonian Empire, because he is able to do that because he's married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's daughter and her husband, who's the new ruler, have a son, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar through his daughter. And the grandson is holding a banquet. And the banquet there comes the finger of God writing on the handwriting on the wall. Now this is 536 BC. Cyrus II, who is Cyrus the Great, is going to come in on that night, and he is going to take over the Babylonian Empire, do away with the Babylonian Empire, even though the Babylonian country will still exist under the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire is born. Now Darius I was Cyrus's general, who actually led the battle. When you're reading through Daniel and you catch it there, Darius I is leading the battle. Darius I is going to become a king of the Persian Empire, not next, but after the son of Cyrus. I'll show that to you in just a minute. And the reason why Darius can do that, even though he's not of the bloodline of Darius, is just like the The king who followed Nebuchadnezzar, who had married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, well, Darius the First marries Atassa, who was the daughter of Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus the Great lives for, by the way, Cyrus the Great is the one who led all the Jews who wanted to go back from the Persian Empire, wherever they were they in Egypt or where, it didn't matter. They could go back to the Judean area if they wanted to. It's Daniel chapter 5. The Persians did not use the word king, by the way. Their word for king was Ahasuerus. And so that word for king, Ahasuerus, has been transcribed or was transcribed into Hebrew for us so we would know what that title was. Now sometime, if you follow with me, I'm backing up from 536 to 550. Sometime between 550 and 536, Cyrus II the Great has joined his country with Darius the First. Darius is going to be his general, and he's a Mede. So we've got two countries side by side who have joined through marriage, where Darius marries Cyrus the Great's daughter, Atassa. So when Cyrus the Great died after 4 years of sending the Jews back, which he did in 536, his son Cambyses II became the king for 8 years. When Cambyses died, his brother-in-law, who had married his sister, became the king, Darius I, and he rules as the king, or the Ahasuerus, for 36 years. And at his death, his son Xerxes I became the Ahasuerus and ruled for 20 years. And it was during the time of Xerxes I that the story of Esther occurs. Now, the story begins 5 years into Xerxes I's reign. Esther does not become his wife until the 7th year. We'll catch on to that towards the end of today's lesson. So in the first year that Cyrus the Great, 536, of the establishment of the Persian Empire, Cyrus issues a decree that would allow all the Jews to return to the old Judah tribal area where Jerusalem is, of the old promised land, and they're going to be led back by Governor Zerubbabel. They call him governor. He's Zerubbabel. He leads back 42,360 men along with their families. So we don't know how many were part of their families, but we know how many of the men were. We also know that there were 7,337 male and female servants. They're not slaves, they are servants. And they have become, because these Jews have grown in popularity and wealth and status in the Persian Empire, and they had servants, their household servants. Well, when the jobs are going back to Israel, the servants are going, male and female, are going with them because they're really part of the family. Also, 200 male and female singers, the musicians. That totaled up to 49,897 people, all returned back to Jerusalem and the tribal area of Judah. They couldn't go anyplace else because that's the area they were sent to at the time. Now, over time, they're going to be allowed to then begin to scatter up into what's Galilee, around the Samaritan area. They're not going to go in the Samaritan area, but they're going to go up above it in the Galilean area and then across the Jordan River. They're going to be able to scatter it, but that's going to take time for that to happen, and permission is going to have to be given for that to occur. However, many Jewish families did not return with Governor Zerubbabel. They didn't want to go. They loved their life as they were having it there in the Persian Empire, wherever they were back in what we would call today Iran, and also Afghanistan was part of it. That's some of the Mede area, and then some of the area up above. And so they stayed. And so the storyline of Esther occurs, get this, more than 50 years after Zerubbabel has already returned with the Israelites back to Israel. So 50 years have transpired. Now, during Xerxes I's reign, his wife defiled a request that he made of her to come to a banquet he is having with just the men of the Persian Empire, and all the 127 provinces, their leaders were there. It was a big banquet, by the way, with others also, dignitaries, all men, and he wanted to show his wife off because of her beauty. Well, she declined. I'm not coming there. So he sent her away from being his wife, and he decided to put in process a selection of a new queen, and Esther is going to be the queen. That starts in his 5th year, and Esther is chosen in his 7th year. It takes a while for it to happen. In Esther chapter 3, verse 9, Xerxes has put a man by the name of Haman in charge of the king's administration. And Haman has been going through the streets and he's expecting everyone to bow down to him because he's the new grand poobah just underneath Xerxes. And he comes across a man by the name of Mordecai, who happens to be the cousin of Esther and Esther's guardian, by the way. Esther's mother and father are dead, so her cousin, who was much older than she was, took her and became her legal guardian. And Haman expected Mordecai to bow to him, and Mordecai would not. So Haman hated Mordecai. So he went into the king and he said, "King, you know, we got problems with these Jews in our Persian Empire. Let's issue a decree that all the Jews shall be killed on a certain day throughout the entire empire." And so the king, he put the order in front of the king, and I don't know if the king thought about it, but Xerxes the first signed, sealed, and delivered it, and it was sent out to the 127 provinces across the world. It was sent. Every man, every woman, every boy, every girl, Jew, would be annihilated empire-wide on a certain day. They were just to be killed. The Jews would stop being in existence on this certain day anywhere in the Persian Empire. Well, in Esther chapter 4, Esther's cousin Mordecai learns of this plan. He reads the decree and he learns of the plan and he is devastated. So he sends word to Esther. He doesn't go to Esther because he's told Esther, don't let your husband know that you're a Jew, that had already happened before this plan was put in place. So he sends for Esther for them to meet up, but Esther doesn't go. She sends her protector because she's the queen by now. And I haven't told you the story of how she became the queen yet. We'll do that at the end of this lesson. But Esther sends her eunuch protector to speak to Mordecai. And Mordecai sends word back to Esther through her eunuch. And at this time, Esther, of course, is a Jew, but the king doesn't know it. And so with that as the background, Esther sends back word to Mordecai saying, "Oh, my. Chapter 4, verse 11 says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. Now, I don't know if you noticed or not, and I hope you noticed it, but the king has just told us where the hiccup is and where the roadblock is. There's a big hurdle here that can't get over, and it's the principle that we will learn to be the law of the Medes and the Persians. And the law of the Medes and the Persians means that when any king puts a law in place, it cannot be changed by that king or any other king on down the road. Now, by the way, this law is a law over all laws. And the law that's been put in place is going to trickle down through the kings through the years. No other Persian king can ever change that law. And it is going to lead to the oppression of women, and to where women in those nations or in the Persian Empire at that time, when this law was put down, it's going to lead to the current oppression that is in all the Islamic countries over there, and Afghanistan and everything, that is so oppressive to women. And it starts with either Xerxes or Darius or someone, but we know it starts actually with Xerxes the first, because we're going to read about it here in just a minute. It means that once that Persian law is put in place, signed, sealed, and delivered, no king can break it. So when Esther says he has but one law, she's saying, okay, there's a law on the books. That law on the books is if you go to the king without him being summoned, then the law is you're to be put to death. So he's telling us that that's the law, you're going to be put to death. Now, that's not the law that oppresses women. The law that oppresses the women is going to actually comes with Vashti, but I'll tell you about that at the end of the story. So Esther knows that law was either put in place about if you approach the king without being summoned, that either was put in place by Cyrus, it was put in place by Cambyses, it was put in place by Darius the First, it could have been placed by Xerxes, we don't know. But somebody put the law in place. If you approach the king without being summoned, the guards of the king, the 24-hour guards of the king, are going to kill you immediately. Any man or woman who comes to the king in the inner court who is not summoned. Now, in the court is where the throne is. So you're not going to come to him in the throne room. One law, and that is if you try to get into the throne room to make a legal request of the king on any legal matter, and he doesn't summon you in by holding out his golden scepter, it is death. So, we've got this law, and it can never be changed. So Mordecai has asked Esther to approach her husband to stop the law that has been put in place to annihilate every Jew, but it is impossible. This means that every Jew, whether it be all those 43,600 plus Jews that 50 years before had gone back to Israel, to Jerusalem, plus all the kiddos that have been born through the years, and all the Jews in Egypt, and all the Jews up in what we call Turkey today, and Syria, and what we call Iraq, and Iran, and Afghanistan, and down in Saudi Arabia, anybody with Jewish blood in them, they are going to be annihilated on a certain day at the end of the year. So Mordecai has asked her to do this, but she doesn't see a clear path to do that. And so she replied to him and showed her fear of approaching even her own husband in that inner court without being summoned, the court that has the throne room in it. She had not been in the courtroom in over a month. So this is where the point in the story where the source question comes. When Esther went into the king's court, could she have been killed? It actually should say the inner court, because the king rarely went out into the king's court, which was in front of his inner court, and we'll show that to you in a picture in just a moment. Now, this scenario absolutely does not mean that Esther did not see her husband every night. No, but to make a legal request and signed and verdicts and all that were recorded, everything that was happened by the scribes and everything, so that if it went into the law, it was in the law. Okay, now I'm going to jump ahead. I'm actually going to skip through chapters 1 and all that kind of stuff about how Esther was selected until the end of the lesson, and I want to get into chapter 5. And there we read, now it came about on the third day, which was 3 days after she told Mordecai she didn't know how she was going to do it. Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. So here I've got a map for you. Okay, from right to left. We've got the king's court, we've got the king's inner courtroom where the throne is, and we've got the king's living quarters or the king's rooms behind the court. Now, Esther is going to try to come to the door, which you see the opening between the inner court and the king's court. It's a smaller room, and that's where the throne is. You do not go into that room without being summoned. Now, on his throne, the king can see into the king's court. And by the way, there's all sorts of business going on in the king's court. Deeds are being filed. Other little magistrates are handling other problems that are happening. You're transacting business of different type of stuff. And the king, if he's watching and he's seeing what's going out there, and if he summons to you, you may come to him. Or if one of his officers, he calls over and says, hey, go get her. She's been summoned. You can go through that entrance and you can go to the king's throne where he is. Well, that's where the problem occurs. Once he saw you, you could come in. But if you go into that king's throne room without being announced, the guards that are the bodyguards of the king are going to strike you down if they have not seen the scepter handed out towards you and pointed to you to allow you to come in. And of course, when he came in, you come in and touch the scepter to show that he had the authority. So when you got into the throne room, you could make your plea to the king. So other court business, of course, was going on outside in the big court area. Okay, so the guards at the gate would make sure and guard the king. Mordecai, when knowing all of this is in place, Esther replied to Mordecai the way she did. I don't know if I can get in to see the king in the inner court because I've not been summoned there in 30 days. But that doesn't mean that she hasn't been with him every night. It's just the business is done in the court. Mordecai then replies to Esther as follows. He says, then the scripture says, then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. Now I want to stop right there for a moment. Mordecai has just made a prophecy. Esther, if you don't stop the Jews from being annihilated and all killed, you need to understand God, Israel and the Jews are the apple of God's eyes. And He is going to send some other nation, some other people who are going to come and are going to bring relief to the Jews. And that means that your father's house, my house, and your house, as long as we're here in the capital city with the king, and your husband, the Persian Empire and the Persian government is going to be overthrown and you're going to perish. Okay, so that's what he's saying there. But then he goes on to say, and who knows whether you have attained royalty for such a time as this. Esther, you're not going to escape this if you don't do something about this. Esther, if you don't do something about this, look at yourself. Do you think you, a Jew, who is now the queen of the Persian king, that you were not put in this place by God for such a time as this? So Esther had to make a plan. And so she made a plan. And in chapter 5, she's going to set the plan in motion. And so 3 days later, on the third day, after she had corresponded with Mordecai through her protector eunuch, there's a middleman in here going back and forth, by the way, she's going to step to the door of the king's inner court, right there where it's off limits. And when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, extended to Esther the golden scepter, which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. She is at his throne. Then the king said to her, what is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? She's got a legal request. And he says, hey, get this. You're my wife. Even to half of the kingdom, it shall be given to you. He loves Esther. He'll give her half the kingdom. And Esther said, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to a banquet that I have prepared for him. Oh, she did a good plan. Oh, what a plan. She knows she shouldn't handle the really bad business in front of the entire court. She wants to handle it in front of the one so that the king can see the reaction of the one who did the bad deal, who got the bad law put in place. Oh, instead of pleading her case for the Jews, she had a special banquet and invitation. I want to throw a banquet for Haman this afternoon. Would you come? Well, yes, he does. So in the rest of the chapter, Esther reveals Haman's plan to her husband in front of Haman. And she evidently shows the proof. And the king ought to have known the proof because he signed it, unless he had signed and sealed it by a plot of deception on Haman's part, that the king was just signing a bunch of decrees and stamping his seal and did not know what he had signed. And he was so upset. He had Haman killed on the same scaffolding that Haman had erected for Mordecai to be killed upon, because Haman could not stand Mordecai. But the law was in place. Xerxes couldn't do anything about it. On that certain day, in all 127 provinces across the Persian Empire, the Jews were going to be killed. The Persians were going to try to kill the Jews. And there's nothing he could do about it. Nothing he could do about it. Well, nothing to change the law, I'll put it that way. To save the Jews and to save his wife Esther, the king was going to have to find this workaround around the law that he had put in place. And he did. But he could not guarantee Esther of the results on that faithful day, because the Persians were still going to try to kill the Jews. What did he do? Here's what he did. He signed and sealed a new law allowing the Jews throughout the entire empire, telling them, on that day you fight back. And when that day arrived, 75,000 Persians were killed, and not one Jew lost his life. It worked. After that, the king did something special with Mordecai. He made Mordecai the second in command of the entire Persian Empire. He gave Mordecai the job of Haman, by the way. A Jew, second in charge of the Persian Empire. We call it Iran. A Jew was in charge. A Jew that all the Iranians today hate. I'm going to follow up on that in just a minute. I've got a lot of promises, don't I? Isn't it interesting? When Joseph was sold into bondage in Egypt, within just a few years, he became the second in command, a Jew, second in command of the Egyptian Empire. When Daniel was sent into exile under Nebuchadnezzar, within the second year, Daniel was the second in charge, a Jew, second in charge of the Babylonian Empire. At the deaths of Mordecai and Esther, when they died, a mausoleum was built for them in the Hamadan province in Hamad, Iran. It's the old ancient city, Ecbatana. That's noted over, we find that over in Ezra chapter 6, verse 2. I've got pictures here for you. The top one is the mausoleum. It still stands today. If you can get into Iran, you can go over there and you can go to this mausoleum. And when you go inside, you'll notice that there's Hebrew writing all around the walls. The sarcophagus that is there to the left of the picture is Esther's. Her bones, her body are in there. And the one to the right, that is Mordecai. His bones and his body is in that sarcophagus right there. By the way, still today, if any of the Jews who are still living in Iran can make the pilgrimage, which kind of has been not really allowed since 1979, for the uprising of Iran, where Iran just turned. By the way, until 1979, Iran was a favorable country with the United States. We helped them, they helped us. I mean, we were friends. And of course, there was a revolt in 1979 against the dynasty descendants who were kings of Iran from the time of Cyrus the Great all the way down to the time of the Shah of Iran. More than 2,500 years, the same bloodline flowed from Cyrus all the way down to the Shah of Iran. Of course, there was a revolt with the college students in Iran who totally turned upside down all of the laws of the Medes and the Persians and all of that they did not like, and they did not like. Islam had come in. They had learned the laws. They hated Jews. They hated Christians. And of course, that all turned around on us in 1979. But if you're a Jew in Iran, you still want to make a pilgrimage to go see the sarcophagus in the mausoleum of Esther and Mordecai. So as for the question, when Esther went into the king's court, could she have been killed? Absolutely, she could have. And at that time, when Esther needed to approach her husband, she did not know. She had not been his queen long enough to know what he would do or how he would react. She just did not know about it. So I want to tell you the backstory on that. How come? Why did she not know what the king would do? And here's the backstory. After the king's first wife, her name was Vashti, refused to go be shown off, her beauty shown off to the men, the king made a law and a decree, and the law and decree was this, that all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small, that every man should be the master in his own house. This is going to begin oppression against women in Iran. It's a law of the Medes and the Persians, and it cannot be changed for 2,500 years. It is still not changed now. It is in the culture. It came from Xerxes. It was an oppression that, listen, no longer did women have equal status at all among the men like they had before in the empire. So Vashti was forbidden to come before the king by the signed and sealed edict. And the men who were of the kingdom were so happy with Xerxes because they said, listen, when your wife refused and defiled you, our wives started defiling us. And now thank you for the law, because listen, if you broke it, you would die. The women would die. And so that began the oppression. This occurred at the end of the king's 5th year, whenever Vashti was put out and the law went in place. The 5th year of Xerxes' reign. And so the king needed a new wife. And so in Esther chapter 2, we learn that all the beautiful virgins, now you had to be a beautiful virgin, they went out into all 127 provinces across the entire Persian Empire. And they brought in all the beautiful virgins to a town called Susa, and they placed them in a virgin harem. That means where all the virgin, beautiful women, young girls and all that would be there. And there they were given all this special stuff. They were beautified, cosmetic. They were given baths, and they were dipped in this and dipped in that and all that type of stuff. No different than what our women try to do now, especially the younger women. They're painting this and painting that and doing this and doing that, and over here and over there, bathing up and bathing down, all trying to be beautiful. And they did that for 12 months. And then at the end of 12 months, Xerxes doesn't have a queen for all of this time, taking Vashti's place. This all took a year to happen to get into place. And then, night after night, woman after woman, virgin after virgin, goes to spend a night with the king. And when they come out for the night, if that king did not, Xerxes I, had not chosen that woman to be the queen, she did not go back to the harem of the virgins. She went to the harem of the non-virgins, who had a different eunuch who was taking care of those women. And by the way, they would still be part of that harem of the non-virgins until the day they died. They were never released from that harem to go and live out in the world, like in families and everything, as they had been with the king. Esther's turn comes, the night with the king. It happens in the 10th month of Xerxes' 7th year as king. A year and a half after his 5th year, he's into his 7th year, in the 10th month of his 7th year, and she has just become his queen. Esther's lived through all of this stuff. She's seen these women come and then end up in the other one, come and go, come and go, come and go, and come and go. And it's taken, get this, 7 months before Esther, every night. 7 months. Just add up how many women have gone through to see the king, and Esther is selected. She didn't know what the king would do, but she had seen the king's wrath through all this time. Now we have to remember in the conclusion here that the Bible record occurred in Persia. And this is very, very important. It did not occur in Israel. It occurred in Persia. If it had occurred in Israel, the Lord never set up a law where women would be put in their place under the penalty of death, and their husbands were to master over them. The law of the Lord, even though the story of Esther is in the Old Testament, where this is being told, Persia is way over there, 1,000, almost 1,100 miles away. It's living under the world of the Gentile laws, which are no laws at all. They don't even know the laws of the Lord. And the Persian law was put in place that because of Vashti, and it could not be revoked. And it was firmly in place all through these years, even through the years of Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in 331 BC, it had been at least 148 years since Xerxes put the law in place. And by this time, it is so rooted deeply into all what will become the Islamic nations. Afghanistan, the Mede area, the Persian area, Iran, Iraq, Babylon, all so rooted that the women are to be oppressed. The wives are to be depressed. And finally comes out where before the law for Vashti, the women were educated. They could read. They had rights. They were equal partners with their husbands. And now, they are no longer equal partners with their husbands. They're basically there to give birth to children. And if one doesn't do good, they get another one and they kill the old one. You know how that is today over in those countries. And they are not allowed to read and write. And you've seen those stories. They are not allowed to have education. They're not allowed to do so many things. They are so oppressed because of the law that came from Xerxes I when he issued the law of the Medes and the Persians on Vashti. And it never could be revoked, all the way down to 1979, when the last line of the kings that descended from Cyrus the Great was ousted, the Shah of Iran in 1979, under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, by the way. 2,500 years of the longest line of descending bloodlines of a king in any group. Even though the Persian Empire was overrun by the Greek Empire, the Persian king was still allowed to be in place. Alexander the Great allowed that to happen. And it kept going down and down and down and down and down until 1979 with the Shah of Iran, and he was ousted. Then the kingship changed, the ruler changed to what they now have a president instead. But women were oppressed, just oppressed. Nevertheless, the laws of the Lord for the nation of Israel protected women, as I've shown you in the past. We've been through these in the laws of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. We've seen how women are given equal access. In fact, they even have more protections for them than the men have. And they were allowed into every court, and some of them became judges. And some of them, one of them at least, became a queen over the nation, over one of the nations of Israel, one of the kingdoms of Israel. She became a king for 6 years. Women were of high esteem, high esteem. But when the northern kingdom split off, if you remember, they started moving away from the laws of the Lord, and that's the reason why they fell into exile in the first place. It was not His will for women to be oppressed, and the northern kingdom began to oppress women. It was not His will, and it was not His will but what was His will was this. It was His will for women to be held in esteem as partners with their husbands. So let me sum it up this way. Persia was over there. Israel was over here. The laws of the Lord would not go to the rest of the Gentile nations in any form until the day of Pentecost, when there were 14 countries across the whole Roman Empire, which, by the way, included all the Persian Empire that we're talking about now, all the way over to Britain and Spain on the other side, down on the African coastline also with Egypt and all that. That's all Roman Empire. Whenever the day of Pentecost occurs, Jews from all over the whole Roman Empire, 14 different countries that basically spanned that whole distance, were saved. 3,000 men on that day, and others, women and children were too, women and girls were too, were saved on that day, and within 90 days they had returned to their homes and began building churches. The law of the Lord, as the churches were built, began going into the cultures. And it's not long, between all the Western nations at least, that law of the Lord from the Old Testament becomes what's called common law. Of course, when we come to America, we take common law and it becomes the basis of our laws today in the United States. Our laws are based on the Bible. But in Esther's day, that wasn't the case. It would be more than 500 years after Esther before the common law of the Lord would begin taking over. And it actually influenced Iran until the revolt in 1979. But the sad part about it all was the custom of what the law was that was put in place because of what Vashti did and what Xerxes I put in place caused the oppression of the women in all those countries today. And it goes back to that day. But Lord put Esther in place for such a time as it was when she was there, for a big purpose. The purpose was, if she had not done something, we would have no Jews today. We would have no Jews today. And all those promises that were given in the Old Testament that are going to span out through the rest of eternity could not be fulfilled if it had not been for the courage of Esther to put on her robes on the third day and go ask and make a plan and ask if her husband would meet with her so that she in a banquet with Haman, so that she could show what the king had done and who to blame it on. And she did. And we have all that prophecy left for the Jews to watch as it folds out into the future because of what Esther was brave enough to do.